The rules for Magic are changing, but is that Mulla good or Mulla bad? Oh, that's terrible. I'm using it anyways. Greetings, owners of fine luxury cardboard rectangles. We are here today to discuss the London Mulligan, more specifically the article by Ian Duke. I'm going to go through this and read it out for you here, as well as offering my own perspectives on this. Now, before we dive into the article itself, I just want to give you a little history of my deal with mulligans, because I started playing Magic the Gathering when there was only one variety of mulligan that was available. I call it the Ultra Hosed Edition Mulligan Rules, where the only time you were allowed to take a mulligan was if you had no lands in your hand or all lands in your hand. Now, the mulligan rule has changed a number of times over the years, and those are the far gone days. But I still remember, especially when I go back to playing Chandelar, because they still use those old mulligan rules, how brutal that was. If you had a 1-land hand, you had to keep it. You have a 6-land hand, you have to keep it. The only other way you would get a mulligan is if your opponent had no lands or all lands. So those were rough times, and Wizards of the Coast keeps changing things in an attempt to find the sweet spot for mulligan rules. So the article starts out thusly. With the release of Core Set 2020, we'll be introducing a new mulligan system for all competitive Magic formats. This new mulligan was tested at Mythic Championship 2 in London, as well as on Magic Online, and will work as follows. 1.3.4. Each player draws a number of cards equal to their starting hand size, which is normally 7. Some effects can modify a player's starting hand size, so keep that in mind. A player who is dissatisfied with their initial hand may take a mulligan. First, the starting player declares whether they will take a mulligan, then each other player in turn order does the same. Once each player has made a declaration, all players who decide to take mulligans do so at the same time. To take a mulligan, a player shuffles the cards in their hand back into the library, draws a new hand of cards equal to their starting hand size, then puts a number of those cards equal to the number of times that player has taken a mulligan on the bottom of their library in any order. Once a player chooses not to take a mulligan, the remaining cards become that player's opening hand, and that player may not take any further mulligans. This process is then repeated until no player takes a mulligan. A player can take mulligans until their opening hand would be 0 cards. So that is a big chunk of words. For those of you who didn't quite follow what it's saying, essentially, first off, you draw your starting hand, and in this case, we're going to use a starting hand of 7 cards, because most people, that's what you're going to be used to. So you'd start with a hand of 7 cards. Let's say you go, no, I don't like this hand. Just like the previous mulligan, you will take these and you basically, you put these cards back into your deck. So you shuffle them back into your deck as you would with a normal mulligan style situation. But then instead of drawing 6 cards like you would before, you draw 7 cards again. But then the first time you mulligan, you pick 1 card and go, okay, that card is not going to be part of my starting hand. That goes to the bottom of the library. And if you looked at the hand again and said, this still isn't good enough, then you would shuffle your deck back up again, draw 7 cards again, but because it's the second time you've mulliganed, you would then go yoink and you take out 2 cards. So each time you're mulliganing, your hand shrinks by 1, but you get to decide what cards are being pitched away. That's the difference right there. And bear in mind as well, and I'm sure the article will probably mention it, but you no longer get to scry like you used to with the old mulligan rule. That has changed. So the article continues. Essentially, each time you take a mulligan, you drop to 7 cards, then put a number of cards from your hand equal to the number of times you've mulliganed this game on the bottom of your library in any order of your choice. I like how it's like, essentially, it's still pretty wordy. I'm going to make it less wordy, still pretty wordy. Your starting hand will still be down a card each time you mulligan, but you'll always get to select that starting hand from a choice among 7 cards. Unlike the current Vancouver mulligan, there's no scry after you decide your starting hand. So we're leaving Vancouver and heading to London, son. All right, this rule goes into effect starting with Core 2020 rules update. We're going to continue on to talk about when the new rule will be implemented on Tabletop Magic Online and Magic the Gathering Arena. So The goal of this new London Mulligan is to make games where one or more players mulligan more competitive, make one or more players mulligans more competitive, especially in cases where players mulligan an unequal number of times. In particular, greater selection of the starting hand will reduce the number of non-games where a player's deck is unable to function due to not having a reasonable mix of land and spells. We all know what that's like. You sit there and go, look, I can't even get into the game. I don't get to play because I'm stuck here sitting on lands. And mulligan is a feel-bad scenario, especially when you mulligan multiple times and you don't get enough land. If you mulligan a hand with one land and then you draw another hand with one land or no lands, it feels so awful. And by the time you mulligan down to 5, your brain already starts to go, are we even in this game anymore? We understand that some aspects of this change are bound to be debated, as is the case with any rules change. And it makes sense. Obviously, the community should weigh in and give their opinions on this sort of thing. A big part of what makes Magic such an amazing game is that it's constantly evolving and improving. We, as designers, strive not only to provide new card content, but also to continue to update the game's rules and systems to provide the most enjoyable and competitive experiences we can. I'd like to share some insight as to why we're making this change and what we expect the results to be. So the next section goes on to say, why change? Magic Mulligan system has changed several times throughout the game's history, from the early no land, all land, to the Paris Mulligan and the more recent Vancouver Mulligan. The goal of each change has been to give players a better chance of having a reasonable opening draw, leading to a competitive game where either player might win. Ideally, that's what you want, everybody to have a shot in a match, so it makes sense to me. As more and more games of Magic are being played these days across both tabletop and digital platforms, we've gathered data that shows that even the current Vancouver Mulligan isn't doing as good a job as it could be in providing a competitive starting point for both players. A player who mulligans once against an opponent who keeps 7 cards in general is at more of a disadvantage than we are comfortable with. The situation gets even worse for a player who mulligans 2 or more times more than their opponent. We also dislike that some of those games play out in uninteresting ways where it's clear that the game was nearly over before it began based on starting hands alone. And as I mentioned before, we all know that feeling. That is a rough spot to be in. It's a really unenjoyable aspect of Magic. You're playing the game to play, after all. Over the past year, R&D has been actively discussing and testing ways to improve how games begin. We've tested the new London Mulligan internally for more than 6 months, and we're pleased with how it closes the gap between a player who mulligans and an opponent who doesn't, and also how it greatly reduces the number of games where a player's deck and strategy simply don't function at all. In this sense, we think of the London Mulligan as being a stronger mulligan in the player's favor as compared to the Vancouver Mulligan. The next section is testing the mulligan. Of course, in strengthening the mulligan, there could be such a thing as going too far. A mulligan that's too strong and gives too much agency over a player's opening hand could make too many games play out the same way. There's also a risk that combo decks could abuse a very strong mulligan to much more reliably assemble a combo early in the game. Now, this is something that I touched on before. I've done a video about the London Mulligan before, where I touched on the concept of the dangers of this giving too much of an advantage to combo decks. So what I'll do is, instead of rehashing everything I said in that video, I will leave a link for that video on the end screen of this video. So if you want to go and hear more in-depth thoughts from me about the risk that this poses to the combo deck prevalence, then you can go over there and check that out. And it continues, or that aggressive decks always having their best draw, or control decks always having the right answer. And so all these things could change the metagame balance too dramatically. Plus, the stronger the mulligan, the more often players will choose to use it, which increases time spent shuffling and making decisions before the game can begin. This is true. This, I feel, is going to be a point of frustration on Arena specifically. It's there are definitely some downsides to this. The impact is yet to be seen. While Wizards has tested it internally, internal tests aren't the same like as real field tests where you put it out, boom, to the world and see what happens on a large scale, right? If Wizards of the Coast could predict what was best for Magic and test internally perfectly, they wouldn't have the need to ever ban things in Standard because they would be 100% on their game, which they're not. These are the risks we knew we needed to look out for while testing the London Mulligan both internally and publicly. Our hope was that it would be enough stronger than the Vancouver Mulligan to make a difference in reducing the number of non-games, but not so much stronger as to have detrimental effects on gameplay as a whole. We still want mulliganing to be something a player prefers not to do if they have a reasonable hand. We just want it to be a little less punishing when a mulligan is necessary. And honestly, I applaud Wizards for this point, trying to find ways to make mulligans not appealing enough that they become a regular occurrence, but also less punishing so that you're able to still keep a foot in the game. That is a good goal to have. While we've been very happy with how the London Mulligan was playing in Standard and Limited, we knew that the biggest risks would be in non-rotating formats where the card pool is deeper. Games are generally faster, and the best draws from combo decks are stronger. That's why we chose Mythic Championship 2 in London with its modern constructed rounds and open deck list policy as a competitive testing ground. If the new Mulligan was too strong, that's an environment in which we believe we'd see it break. Now, I have a couple of points to make about this. One is that when I actually went and looked over all the deck lists provided, because you can see them all online, Wizards of the Coast has all the deck lists for Mythic Championship 2 posted, there was a very wide range of different deck types. It was a very diverse field of decks, which, so for this kind of level of the test, I think that's pretty decent with the number of samplings, but at the same time, it's not like people knew a crazy amount of time in advance that this was going to be tested in that way. So it's not a perfect stress test. It's going to take time of seeing how it operates in different formats over a longer period of time to really see how much it warps deck building, because not everybody will have completely changed their deck around the concept of, wait, you know what, I can mulligan strategically in this way. So we will see some changes in that going forward, I imagine. But this is an interesting experiment, to say the least. Now, moving on to the next section, what we've learned. By and large, what we've seen is that the upsides of the London Mulligan outweigh the downsides and risks. Mythic Championship 2 featured a diverse and healthy modern metagame, and again, I agree with this, I checked for myself, both in terms of what decks players brought and which decks performed well. While some elements of the risk above showed up to small degrees, like more frequent mulligans overall, we did not see what we felt were large systemic problems arise in the metagame or in gameplay. That combos were assembled a bit more frequently was largely counterbalanced by sideboard cards appearing more often, and it appears as though the metagame was able to self-correct. Now, this is something to note. They're talking about sideboards helping to counterbalance combo, and I think that what we can take from this is that it's probably going to become, in Arena Best of 1, we are probably going to see a rise in combo decks because this counterbalance that they're talking about won't exist. When you're playing Best of 1, there are no sideboards. So you have to be able to answer things in your first game because it's the only chance you're going to get. So this London Mulligan does feel less balanced when applied specifically to Best of 1. But when it comes to traditional tabletop Magic or even playing traditional Magic in Arena, that is not the case. The article continues, that being said, make no mistake, we do expect metagames to change somewhat with the introduction of the London Mulligan. Anytime a game system introduces changes like the new Mulligan rule, it affects some decks differently than others. The question is whether the metagame will adapt to those changes and come to a new healthy equilibrium. So far, all signs point to yes, including for Modern. I would not be surprised at all to see more combo cards getting banned in terms of Modern and the older formats. I also wouldn't be surprised to see Wizards intentionally weakening possible combos going forwards in standard, considering how much Arena is their baby and how many people like to just play best of 1 matches due to time constraints and the way that things feel slower on Arena. It's different. You could spend the same amount of time waiting for your opponent in person to do something, and it wouldn't feel as agonizing and boring as it does when you're playing Arena. So best of 1 is something that does influence. I think best of 1 is something that's going to influence card design. So this may actually lead to the nerfing of combos to a degree. The article continues, we expect the London Mulligan to be almost all upside for Standard and Limited. In those formats, being down a card in the starting hand is enough of a penalty that we don't anticipate players mulliganing much more aggressively than under the current Vancouver mulligan. It'll just make for more enjoyable games when mulligans do need to happen. And I can see this bearing out to be true, because in all honesty, the power level of standard is weaker than modern. So being able to make sure you have key cards for the deck isn't going to be as important, as your strategy is going to be more spread out across the deck. Whereas in modern, it can be blisteringly fast. It depends on particular cards showing up, and you can key yourself into getting those cards faster with the mulligans. So I can see how in this case, it would appear that it's not going to affect that much in terms of standard and limited, although I stand by what I said about combos in best of one becoming more of a thing, most likely. We understand the players have had some concerns about eternal formats, particularly Legacy and Vintage. We agreed, and gathering data on these formats is part of why we tested the mulligan on Magic Online. From what we saw, the metagames were able to adjust even better than expected. One characteristic of Legacy is that there are very efficient one-for-one answers to most threats, which has the effect of making raw card quantity important. That in turn means choosing to mulligan aggressively to a particular card or combo is more of a cost, and so we weren't seeing that strategy be very successful. So in these formats, being down a card matters a lot, because there's a lot of ways to answer what's going on, and digging to get particular cards and keeping yourself lower in terms of card resources. It's like old school Magic, where card advantage was a huge deal. Having access to more cards than your opponent was a huge deal. Now, it says Vintage is hard to gather data on due to smaller sample sizes, but we did not see any alarming imbalances jump out. For example, the win rate of Dredge did not change markedly, even with a greater chance of finding Bazaar of Baghdad in the opening hand. Again, this is perhaps counterbalanced by other decks also more reliably finding the sideboard cards. It's the perhaps thing. They don't really know, but I'll be truthful. I don't think Wizards of the Coast really cares about the health of the Vintage formats, because they're based on cards that Wizards can't actually reprint due to the reserved list. So I think that even if the London Mulligan really negatively impacted Vintage and things like that, they would probably just go, you can use the old Vancouver rule, or we don't care. I don't think they would scrap this mulligan overall. That's my feeling on the subject. Our approach for all formats will be to allow players and metagames to adjust and to gather data and feedback before considering any banned and restricted list changes. This is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about when I said that they're probably gonna end up nerfing some cards where it's like, all right, we've got a situation where combo might get out of control and we may have to bring that hammer down. But they're not doing it preemptively, and I think that's a good idea because they don't have quite as much foresight as they think they do. It says trying to be predictive with changes isn't the right approach for us or for the community. This is correct. It's not, because they're not capable of it. To be clear, we don't currently have any specific cards or decks that we expect to have to target with B&R changes, though it's possible that need for change emerges down the road. Some members of the community have suggested introducing the London Mulligan on a format-by-format basis, but as designers, we feel strongly that having one unified mulligan rule for all of Magic is the right path forward. I agree. The less baggage that it has from format to format, where you have to remember, oh, this one has this particular mulligan rule, this one has this one, it's just easier. Many Magic players tried a variety of different formats over their lifetime, and having inconsistent mulligan rules across these formats would be a substantial added complexity cost. From a technical standpoint, it's also a consistency benefit for both the tabletop comprehensive rules and digital rule engines to have a unified mulligan rule that exists above the subdivision of different formats rather than as a separate rule within each. So, as you can see, when it comes to programming for games, they also are like, it's just going to be easier across the board. We don't have to program our different, like Arena, MTGO, to handle different kind of mulligans. It's just easier across the board, and that's the way we're going to go. Now, the article, the next section is just where it finishes off and says, when can I use it? We'll be rolling out the London Mulligan in all tabletop and digital expressions of Magic with the release of Core Set 2020. Starting with tabletop Core Set 2020 pre-releases on July 5th, the new mulligan will be used for all play. So about a month from now. It's a month and a couple of days from the release of this video. It will be officially reflected in the comprehensive rules with the M20 rules updates on July 12th. MTG Arena will test functionality of the London Mulligan in a special event starting June 7th. So for anybody on Arena, it actually will start in a few days. and will fully adopt it for all play formats with the release of M20 card content starting on July 2nd. Magic Online will be using the London Mulligan on July 2nd after the servers come up from scheduled downtime. It's funny how it's like, we want to do universal things because we find it adds extra complexity, but we're going to stagger different days when we actually release the rule. It's a little bit silly, just a tiny bit silly. So, it finishes off with saying, we hope you all enjoy playing with the new Mulligan as much as we have internally. We understand that change can be hard to digest, especially for a community as deeply invested as Magic's. But in the end, the goal of this change is to make Magic more fun, and we have confidence that it will. It's very true that the Magic community will get, oh my God, things are changing. When I look at this Mulligan change, to me, when you put aside the potential for a beefing up in strength of combo decks, I am on board with the Mulligan rule. I've had time to think about it from my first video, again, which I will link at the end of this video, talking about my thoughts of combos and the issues that it may cause. I think that overall, it's probably going to turn out to be fine. Yes, it may result in some combos getting banned for being too strong now in the current environment, but that's something that's always been a part of Magic. When something becomes too strong, you have to bring the ban hammer down, because if you don't, it basically ruins whatever format that you don't do that in. And the format quickly devolves into, instead of here's a bunch of different decks being played, you've got the best deck and the deck that can beat on the best deck. And that's basically like the two that you play. Either you play as God or you play as the God Smasher. That's what it boils down to. So bannings are a necessary evil in Magic the Gathering. It's never fun to have your cards be useless, where it's like, okay, I mean, I know I spent money on these and everything, but now they're useless and worthless. So that's not a good feeling. But overall, I think that Wizards of the Coast should continue to improve and flex out when it comes to things like Mulligan rules. They don't change them every week. It's a serious amount of time between each of these Mulligan changes, and each one has felt like a step in the right direction. And I expect that once I get used to playing with this one as well, I will probably feel the same way. This is my initial thoughts, though. If it turns out after it's been enacted that I feel differently, I will definitely come back and let you guys know that for me it's a thumbs down. But currently, I'm hopeful that this won't lead to us seeing the best of one. One of the things I'm worried about is the best of one arena becoming very, very combo-centric, very, very combo-heavy. That's not a world I want to live in, with a ton of combos running around, just uncontested smash and face. That's not happy times. But overall, I'd say this is probably pretty good. We can wait and see for sure. That's really all I have to say on the subject. So I will link up my other video here at the end. We're going to roll the golden scroll. These are people who have my back either on Patreon or through channel memberships, or in some cases, both. I thank you all for your continued support. It's very meaningful to me now, especially in these times. So, thanks everyone for being here, and for now, I'm history, baby.